Welcome to the Casual Birder podcast. I'm Susie Buttress. As a casual birder, I take time to watch birds as I go about my daily tasks. In my show, I'll tell you about the wild birds I've seen, speak with other enthusiasts, take bird walks, and share stories from listeners around the world. Last episode, I looked back at my best birding memories of 2020, shared your stories, and revealed the highlights of our December group birdwatch. Do take a listen. In episode 84, I start a series of weekly audio diaries about my lockdown birding, sharing what birds I've seen and the behaviours I've observed, all from my home and the surrounding streets. This episode is brought to you by Casual Birder Weekly, my brand new newsletter. Each week, I'll share birdwatching tips, bird news that has caught my eye, and let you know about any planned group birdwatch events. While the show has a really awesome Facebook group, I know some of you only follow me on Twitter or Instagram. The newsletter is a great way for us all to stay in touch. Sign up now. The link is in the show notes. Currently in Britain, we're in lockdown due to the pandemic. Since the beginning of the year, I've been keeping a journal of my bird sightings and observations. Each of us has differing amounts of access to various habitats. In this series of weekly audio diaries, I'll let you know what I've been seeing in my locally restricted birding. I recorded this week's audio diary standing at my open window. Above the traffic noise, I could hear birds singing in my neighbourhood, and the sound always brings me joy. Lockdown Diaries, Week 1. Since the beginning of the year, I've been keeping a wildlife journal, noting down each day the weather, what birds I see, and any notable occurrences in the garden. I hope that will give me a record throughout the year of when things happen, when buds come out, when the different seasons change and different birds appear. With the start of lockdown, it's become even more important for me to have a focus each day on what's happening in nature. As we go through the weeks of lockdown, I'm going to share my observations with you for what's been happening in my garden. And I hope you'll let me know what you're seeing too. I've described my garden before. It's a suburban garden, about the size of half a tennis court. Mostly has beds, which should really have flowers in, but are mostly weeds and green shrubs. It's a fairly wild garden at the moment. It's not particularly manicured. Half of it is patio, the other half is lawn, beds and shrubs. I have a few small-sized trees. There's a small lilac and an ornamental cherry. An apple tree that we had to move because it was falling down. I'm still not clear whether that's actually died or not, but it makes a great perch for the birds, so we're leaving it in for the moment. And I have an ornamental acer and an acacia tree. Both of those are about 9 feet tall. We also have a greenhouse, which we're not using properly, so hopefully this year I'll make better use of that. And an area of the garden that hopefully will be a vegetable patch. Didn't do very well with it last year, but again, full of good intentions for the year. We have 2 hanging feeders filled with sunflower seed, and another one that's filled with peanuts and suet. I've only just recently put that one out. It's got quite large ports, which means the birds will be able to take a whole peanut from it. So far, the wood pigeons haven't spotted that one. I don't know how long that's going to last, because as soon as one tries to land on it, the whole thing will collapse. It's not a very well made feeder, but it's just very handy for having the wide ports, and I like being able to give the birds an opportunity just to take a nut straight away without the nuts being out in the open to get wet and mouldy. Currently I'm looking out into my garden and I have 2 wood pigeons looking for food. I've got a couple of ground feeding trays out, which I top up with seed each day, and I have a bird table which I generally put sunflower seeds in an open dish and some suet pellets, and recently I've been putting peanuts in shells on, and that table seems to attract the wood pigeons, but also the jackdaws and carrion crow that have been visiting. The jackdaws are quite fun to watch. They'll swoop in and grab a nut and fly off. The carrion crow I've seen stop and break open the nuts there, but I have to be quite careful because they're quite nervous birds in my garden, and so if I want to record or want to watch, I have to kind of sneak round the side of the curtain and not make any movement. I also have a feeder pole with some suet on that, and there's a tray on that which I tend to put things for the robin and dunnock to eat. That tray is partway up the pole and quite close to some shrubs, so it makes good cover for the birds. They can pop out quickly from the shrub, grab some food and then go and hide again. I've also put some apples around the garden. I think they have been eaten by some of the blackbirds, but I was really hoping I might entice some fieldfare or blackcaps into the garden, but no sign of those. So each day I do a morning bird watch, which I record onto eBird. On the first day of lockdown, the weather was overcast. We had some light snow falling, but it was a fairly high cloud base, and it ended up being quite a lot of blue sky visible that day. Before dawn, I heard the red-legged partridge call out. We've got one living in the neighbourhood, and it's been calling out from one of the neighbouring roofs before dawn most days. So on the 5th, we had 3 robins in the garden, which is quite unusual. I usually have 1 or 2. One of them seems to be particularly round, and the other one less so. The one that's not so round has actually been flying to one of our hanging sunflower feeders. Anyway, there were lots of chasing going on that day and a couple of mid-air scraps. The other birds that visited the garden have been my general birds. I always seem to have blackbird, dunnock, and a house sparrow pair. I see them most days. Occasionally we'll get blue tits, and I've had the odd great tit pop in. Hopefully they'll come more frequently now that I've put the nuts out. And on that day we had a red kite fly over, so that was good. I'm always pleased to see the red kite. One of these days I'll get a decent photo of them, hopefully as they're flying towards my bedroom window, which is where I do most of my bird watching. On the second day, again, overcast, low cloud, drizzle, as most of the days have been recently. There was a wren call in while it was still dark, and again the red-legged partridge. I should say the red-legged partridge isn't a native bird. This one has obviously escaped from somewhere. They do release them for shooting. I guess this one made it away, and while it's in the neighbourhood, it's very welcome in my garden. Again, saw blackbird, blue tit, wood pigeon. On that day, had a really good sighting of about 8 or 9 long-tailed tits that turned up in the garden. That was brilliant. We don't see those very often. I had heard them most of the day outside somewhere in the neighbourhood, and happened to look up in the afternoon, and there they were. I was focusing on trying to get some photographs, and I took my camera away from my face and realised that all the while I'd been focusing on this one bird that was a little way away. The tree quite close to me had about 6 long-tailed tits in, which I'd totally not seen because I was so busy focusing on getting one photograph. But anyway, that was a really lovely sight to see. On the 7th, we'd had quite a hard frost overnight, and I went out very early to top up the feeders and noticed that the water in all of the different bird baths was frozen. I only refreshed the one that was closest to me, so at least they had some fresh water in the garden, just because I didn't want to walk all over the mud. So I just did the one that was by the paving, but I think that they appreciated it. I did feel a bit guilty a bit later on when I saw some wood pigeons skating over the top of our water feature, trying to look for some fresh water. I don't know why they do that. You put out fresh water and they seem to ignore that and go to a totally different water bowl. So, lesson for me, I suppose I should fill all of them up, but when it's early in the morning, very cold and ice everywhere, you don't really want to stay outside too long. An interesting observation on that day for me was that I saw the red-legged partridge on a neighbour's roof a couple of houses over, and just after I put the seed out, I heard the whirring of wings and noticed it fly from that house all the way to my house and land on the roof. And soon after I went in, it came down into the garden, so it obviously knew that I was putting out fresh food, and it came over to get it. I don't normally see it fly such a long distance, and certainly not up in the air, so that was quite an unusual sighting for me. We've got a jackdaw that's been visiting the garden that seems to have a poorly right foot, and it can't put weight on it, but it seems to do very well. It can hop around quite well, fly very easily, and it eats well, so I'm not too concerned about it. But it does help identify that bird from the others, so you know when it's coming back into the garden and visiting. Also on the 7th, we had a visit from a carrion crow which stayed quite some time bashing the nuts as it was opening the nuts to eat the nuts inside. But I noticed it taking the outer skin off the nuts, so that was quite interesting. On Friday, we had 4 blackbirds in the garden, which again is quite unusual. Generally, I have a female blackbird in the garden most days. Sometimes I'll see a male. But on that day, there were 4, and the other 2 were, I guess, both males. One of the newer ones is very dark plumage, but not quite black, very dark brown, and it has a brown bill. I'm not sure if that's a female, though. I think it's probably a male, but maybe a first-year male. Anyway, there was lots of rushing around in the shrubs, chasing out to other gardens, and a bit later on they'd come back in again, so they get chased again. And at one point, the male that I think is my male, the one that stays in my garden, snapped its bill at the other bird, and we heard it inside the house through our double glazing, so it was pretty loud snapping. Late in the afternoon, we had a very surprise visitor in the garden. All of a sudden there was an alarm call, looked out, a sparrowhawk had come in and tried to take one of the blackbirds. It was where the shrub was that the blackbirds had been chasing around all day. The sparrowhawk went to the base of that and then walked along the garden a little bit, looking into the shrub, really intently looking for movement. Everything in the garden had just gone totally silent. It was unlucky that time, it didn't get a bird. Fortunately for the blackbirds, but not so fortunately for the sparrowhawk. A blackbird would have made a good meal for it. It was a female sparrowhawk, which I could tell because it had brown plumage and buff undersides with brown streaking. The male sparrowhawk has blue-grey back and peachy undersides. What was nice was I was able to get some video of the sparrowhawk and some photographs. Although I had to take the photographs through my deck railing, it was still quite stunning to see, the beady eyes and it looking at it, staring into the shrub. So that was quite a bit of excitement for Friday. Saturday was foggy, damp and cold. I put food out about 20 past 8 that day, which was a bit later than normal, but it was so dark out it felt much earlier. The male blackbird was defending the garden again. It would hide in the shrub, and then as soon as one of the other blackbirds came to the garden, it would shoot out and call at it and chase it out the garden again. Also on that day, which was more than I would have liked, we had 14 wood pigeon in the garden at one time. Now, I've put out a few different open trays of food, so when I say trays, they're only sort of small plant dishes, and a couple of metal ground feeding trays. It's not a lot of food. Of course, it does mean that the more birds that come in, the more competition there is for taking the food. So it can be a bit fraught when there's a lot of them because there's a lot of antagonistic behaviour. I tried to take a photograph at one point when there was still quite a lot in the garden, and of course what happened was I moved too suddenly. They all took fright, an enormous clapping of wings as they all left the garden, which scared everything out of the garden. On Sunday, although it was foggy, it was fairly calm outside. There were birds singing, so I decided to put my mic outside. Once again, I had a large number of wood pigeons in the garden that day. I had 8. But I also had a visit by a blue tit, which was good, and I could hear a great tit in the neighbourhood, didn't actually see it. The magpie came into the garden and did some chattering, which I always enjoy hearing. Monday, the 11th, it was damp, overcast, windy, dark till really late in the morning. I noticed that we've had a dunnock fly to one of the sunflower seed feeders and take a seed from the feeder, which isn't usual behaviour for dunnocks. They generally ground feeders, hang around under the shrub. I have one that will feed quite often from the tray fixed to the feeder pole, and it will eat there quite happily. But I guess he's learned by watching the others. Because it was happening so early in the morning, I wasn't sure whether it was a house sparrow at first going to the feeder, but I've seen it do it quite a few times now, and spotted that it was actually a dunnock. I needed to clean one of my older feeders out. Not a very pleasant job. especially when it's cold out, but it has to be done. Keeping the feeders clean during the winter, during these periods of damp, is really important, because once the mould grows, the birds might be tempted to still eat it, and it's not good for them. If we choose to feed the birds, we need to make sure we keep them as healthy as possible. The other thing is to make sure that your food is being kept somewhere away from damp. I learned to my cost last year that I'd bought some suet pellets, and I hadn't realised that the sunlight could get to them. So what that did during the autumn was build condensation up inside the tub that they were in, and when I went back to them, some of them had gone mouldy, and I couldn't use any of them then because I didn't know how far the mould had gone. So that was a wasteful lesson, but an important lesson, I guess, to learn. As the year is moving on, there's much more song happening. The robins singing all the time. You can probably hear it now. I haven't heard the blackbirds singing at all. But I did hear a song thrush the other day, quite a long way off, must be many, many gardens over. I do spend a lot of my time in the mornings drinking my coffee, looking out of my bedroom window and watching the birds in the garden. There's always something going on, and it's always that excitement about what's the next bird I'm going to see. So with this journal that I set up, I wrote down a list. I've never done one of these before, so it's quite fun. And I spoke to people in the Facebook group for the show to ask people how they recorded their bird sightings. What did they do in their journals? And oh my goodness, we've got some amazingly talented people. I'm just keeping lists, but there are people drawing pictures of birds and making really fabulous recordings of their sightings, really detailed notes. I just know that I won't continue if I try to spend too much time in it with making the show. But anyway, I'm very, very impressed by what other people do. And their journals are going to be real works of art, really something to look back on. But nevertheless, I have written down all of the species that I saw in or from my garden last year, and I've specified which ones actually were in my garden. Now, what I count as in my garden, anything that's within the boundaries of the garden, anything that's on the shrubs immediately adjacent to the garden, so neighbours have shrubs that the birds might be in. I do count those as being in my garden, even though it's just over the boundary. I don't count any flyovers as being in my garden. I count those being recorded from my garden, but not in my garden. And on neighbouring roofs, they don't count in my garden, but they do count in my list. So anyway, so far this year, I have had actually in my garden 14 species. That's the carrion crow, wood pigeon, dunnock, blackbird, blue tit, jackdaw, magpie, sparrowhawk from that visit last week, robin, great tit, house sparrow, long-tailed tit, red-legged partridge and rook. Now there's still some that I could have in my garden during this period, so it's quite likely I could get great tit and coal tit. I could also get goldfinch and greenfinch. Now I've heard goldfinches, and last year I was getting them extremely regularly, but I've not seen any for a few weeks. But I know they're around because I can hear them going over. A jay, that would be quite unusual, but we have had them. Starling. A starling should be easily achievable in the garden, especially with the suet that I've got out. I've seen a couple fly over, haven't had any in the garden yet. So that's another, with the song thrush I could potentially get in the garden. So it's another 6 species that I could get. And I think I had 23 species in the garden last year. So we'll see how that changes over the next few weeks. Keeping the diary, I think, is going to keep me focused on what's happening outside and noticing things. So every day I'm posting a bird photo on Instagram. Most of those photos have been taken actually on the day or the day before that they're posted. We're going to end up with 40 photos of robins because the robins have been very happy to be posing. So I will have to move on to some of my older photos. But other things, like I noticed in one of the photographs I took when there was frost on one of the plants, that there's buds coming out already. So that'll be something to watch over the next few weeks. As soon as we get a reasonably dry day, I'm going to get outside and start tidying. I don't want to make my garden too tidy, but we have got a lot of ground elder and that will just swamp over and take over. So I want to get rid of that. And I want to try to find some plants which are more native plants, things that will bring during the summer food for the insects. So I'm very keen to do that this year and make sure my garden is friendly to insects. Over the next week, I'm going to look into what plants would be the best ones to get for that. Some of them I've got already, and I just need to perhaps make sure that they're protected in the areas they are, that they're not being overrun by weeds. And I've got some other plants that could do with being moved to other parts of the garden where they could perhaps run a little bit more wild. So anyway, I'm going to look into garden design over the next couple of weeks and see what plants whether I can buy any plants at this time, I don't know, but also look at what plants I already have. So I've not been out for any walks out of the house in the last week. Generally during daylight hours I'm either watching the birds in my garden or getting on with working on elements of the show. But if the weather improves over the next week I will get out. I still haven't seen any of the winter thrushes this year, and so I'm hoping that if I can do a walk that we're allowed, I can get to some of the playing fields nearby and hopefully there'll be some thrushes there. But I'm very happy with my garden birds. I'm extremely happy that they continue to visit. There's always the excitement about what bird am I going to see today, and seeing the interactions between them, seeing the same ones come back. Talking about the same ones coming back, up until before we went to Norfolk at Christmas, we were having our daily visit by our rook friend. I think it's been in the garden, but it's no longer coming for treats. The last time I saw it and was able to give it treats was on the 4th of January. So we got back home on the 26th of December. And from the 26th until the 4th, it hadn't come for treats. It did come on the 4th. That was on a day when it was particularly wet and horrible. So I think it's had enough of the treats that I give and is not interested. Now, whether that will change during the year, I don't know. We've had a couple of periods during last year where, like for maybe 2 weeks, I wouldn't see it at all. And then it would come back. So maybe it's finding enough food in the wild that it doesn't need to come for additional suet. But that's fine, as long as it's healthy, I don't mind. But it's nice to have it come to the garden. It does add some character. So fingers crossed that it comes back. But meanwhile, I've got all the other birds to be focusing on. I can hear the blue tit again in the garden, and it's reminding me that I must move my second bird box. I put that out last year, but realised it gets too much sun during the day, so it's not a viable place for the bird box to be. So I'm going to move that in the next time we've got dry weather. I'll take that off that, and I think I'm going to put it on the side of the summer house, which will be a fairly sheltered location. They may not even find it there, but if they do use it, at least it'll be in a sensible situation. It won't get full sunlight. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed hearing my first week of sightings on lockdown, but do let me know what you're seeing and what changes you're noticing as the weeks go by. Are you hearing more bird song? Are you starting to notice birds pairing up? Do they look like they're looking for nesting spots yet? I'm desperate for springtime to come. I know we've still got the rest of winter to get through, but who knows? So do let me know what you're seeing. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to help support the show's production, you can buy me a virtual coffee at ko-fi.com. Your donations help fund my production costs and are really appreciated. Thanks to Mel, Paul F., Piers, Gustavo, Brant, Jeff, Natasha, and my anonymous supporters for buying me virtual coffees since last episode. Do keep in touch. You can tell me about your sightings by leaving me a message on SpeakPipe or at the contact form on my website, casualbirder.com. And do sign up for my newsletter, Casual Birder Weekly. Make sure you don't miss any episodes by subscribing to the show. Subscribing is free and you can do it wherever you listen. Thank you to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by The Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. check out their website at dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast. If you're still listening, here's a blooper that happened while I was recording this week's episode. But it's been interesting seeing it fly up to the feeder. It does this... Oh, God! That's going to be a blooper for sure.
I tried shouting upstairs, but you weren't responding. So, and I didn't know if you were talking to someone, so I didn't want to blurt out.
Oh my God! Thank you very much for my coffee.
Do you live here?
Yes, thank you. Oh my God!
I'll close this door, shall I? Because I'm going on a call.
Thank you. My husband brought me a cup of coffee and scared the life out of me while I was recording that bit.